Picture this: California, the Central Coast, 1919. You are standing on a ridge of the Santa Lucia Mountains, 1,600 feet above the churning cold waters of the Pacific Ocean. It is a place of silence, a place of hawks circling in the updrafts, of dry yellow grass rattling in the wind, of ancient live oaks casting twisted shadows on the dust. It is remote, truly remote. Los Angeles is 250 miles to the south. San Francisco is 250 miles to the north. In 1919, this is not a weekend getaway. It is a wilderness. It is an expanse of cattle land so vast, so unfathomably large, that it swallows the horizon. And standing on this dusty hilltop, kicking at the dirt with a polished boot, is a man who has just inherited a ranch. But calling the Hearst Ranch a ranch is, quite frankly, an insult to the English language. This was a kingdom, 250,000 acres. Let that sink in for a moment. 250,000 acres, roughly the size of the entire estate of Rhode Island, owned by one family, a distinct private nation-state of rolling hills and craggy coastline. For decades, this particular hilltop, known locally as Camp Hill, had been used for exactly that, camping. The family would trek up the rugged slopes on horseback, pitch elaborate canvas tents, sleep on the hard ground, and eat beans by lantern light. It was rustic, it was charming, it was temporary. But the man standing on the hill in 1919, William Randolph Hearst, was 56 years old. He was a titan of industry, a media mogul, a man accustomed to the finest hotels in Paris and the softest linens in New York. He looked at the tents flapping in the wind. He looked at the dirt, and he decided he was done. He turned to his architect, a diminutive woman named Julia Morgan, and uttered one of the greatest understatements in the history of architecture. He said, "Miss Morgan, we are tired of camping out in the open at the ranch in San Simeon, and I would like to build a little something." A little something? What followed that request was a construction project so massive, so complex, and so relentlessly expensive that it defied logic, gravity, and economics for nearly 3 decades. That little something became La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill, Hearst Castle. To understand what happened on that hill, you have to throw away your concept of a house. This isn't a house, it isn't a mansion, it is a hallucination in concrete and a stone. It is a Mediterranean village perched in the clouds. We are talking about 165 rooms, not a dozen. 165, 56 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, 19 sitting rooms, 127 acres of gardens. Not wild scrub, but manicured, terraced, irrigated gardens bursting with exotic blooms in a landscape that is naturally a desert for half the year. The statistics of Hearst Castle are not just numbers, they are a bludgeon. They beat you into submission with their excess. The main house, the Casa Grande, soars 137 feet into the air. It was modeled after a Spanish cathedral, specifically the Church of Santa Maria la Mayor in Ronda, Spain. But a cathedral wasn't enough. It had to be flanked by 3 guest cottages. And calling them cottages is another joke. The largest one, Casa del Mar, has 5,150 square feet of living space. That cottage alone is larger than the average American mansion today. But why? Why here? Why build a palace where there were only coyotes and cattle? In the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts built Biltmore near a railroad. They built the breakers in Newport, surrounded by their peers. It was a social performance. But Hearst built in isolation. To get materials to the top of this mountain in the 1920s was a logistical nightmare that borders on madness. There were no highways. There was no Pacific Coast Highway as we know it today. Every single bag of cement, every steel beam, every crate of ancient art had to be brought in by steamer ship to a private wharf built at the bottom of the hill. From there, it had to be hauled 5 miles up a winding, treacherous dirt road that turned to soup in the rain and choked you with dust in the summer. We're talking about thousands of tons of rock, iron from England, teak from the East Indies, and water in a dry land. A gravity-based water system had to be engineered to pipe spring water from the pine-jagged peaks of the mountains miles away, channeling it down and then back up to the castle to fill the pools and water the endless gardens. And let's talk about those pools, specifically the Neptune pool. If you have seen one image of Hearst Castle, it is likely this. It is widely considered the most photographed pool in the world, and for good reason. It is not a swimming hole, it is a watery altar to the gods of excess. But the pool you see today, that shimmering expanse of 345,000 gallons of water, was not the first attempt. Oh no, that would be too simple. That would be too rational. Hearst built the Neptune pool 3 separate times. He built it first in 1924. It was lovely. A modest oval basin, but it wasn't enough. He decided it was too small, so he had it ripped out. He expanded it. He added a cascade. That was the second version. But as the years went on, his appetite for grandeur grew. He looked at his pool and decided it still lacked drama. So in 1934, he tore it apart again. For the third and final iteration, he didn't just dig a hole. He reconstructed an ancient temple. The facade of a genuine Roman temple was purchased, shipped from Europe, and reassembled piece by piece at the edge of the water. 6 ancient columns, fluted marble, standing guard over the bathers. The basin itself was lined with marble, not tile, marble. White marble and green serpentine marble from Vermont, the colonnades that surround the pool, reinforced concrete faced with cast stone, engineered to withstand the earthquakes of California. The water in the Neptune pool is so clear, so still, that the reflection of the columns is perfect. It creates a mirror world, standing there with the steam rising off the heated water, looking out over the wild, untamed coastline thousands of feet below. You lose track of time. You lose track of continent. Are you in California? Or are you in Rome at the height of the empire? And this was the point. This was always the point. Hearst wasn't just building a home. He was building a stage set, a backdrop for the drama of his life. Imagine the Roaring Twenties. The Jazz Age. Prohibition is the law of the land, but at San Simeon, the wine flows like water. While the rest of the country is squeezing into speakeasies or struggling on Dust Bowl farms, Hearst is up here in the clouds playing God. He creates a private zoo. And again, let's look at this scale, not a few peacocks. He built the largest private zoo in the world. Guests driving up that 5-mile road wouldn't just see cows, they would see zebras grazing on the hillside, they would see kangaroos hopping through the oaks, camels, giraffes, ostriches. He had polar bears. Yes, polar bears living in California, kept cool in concrete enclosures, washed with blocks of ice. It was a surrealist painting come to life. As you ascended the hill, you left the real world behind. The rules of geography, of biology, of economics, they ceased to apply. You were entering Hearst's reality. But to truly grasp the madness of La Cuesta Encantada, you have to look inside the Casa Grande. Most wealthy men of the era hired decorators. They bought furniture from catalogs or commissioned new pieces. Hearst bought history. He was a ravenous, unstoppable collector. He bought entire ceilings. Let that concept land. He didn't just buy a chandelier to hang from a ceiling. He bought the ceiling itself. He would go to Europe, find a 16th century monastery that was falling into ruin, and buy the Spanish antique wood ceiling. His crews would dismantle it, number every single beam and panel, crate it up, ship it across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, up the coast to San Simeon, haul it up the mountain, and then, and this is the kicker, Julia Morgan would design a room specifically to fit under that ceiling. The house was built to house the art, not the other way around. The assembly room, the massive main gathering space, is a testament to this architectural cannibalism. It is immense, 2,500 square feet. The fireplace is from a French chateau. The tapestries hanging on the walls are from the 16th century. The choir stalls lining the walls, where Hollywood starlets and politicians would sit and drink cocktails, were ripped from Italian cathedrals. These were seats where monks had prayed for centuries. Now, they were seats for Charlie Chaplin and Clark Gable. The clash of eras is deafening. Medieval Gothic mixed with a Spanish Renaissance mixed with 1920s modern plumbing. It creates an atmosphere that is heavy, almost suffocating, with history. It smells of old wax, old wood, and a stone. It is dark, shadowy, illuminated by the flicker of electric bulbs designed to look like candles. And presiding over all of this, the ringmaster of this Astonis circus was William Randolph Hearst. We need to talk about the man, because if George Vanderbilt was the quiet billionaire, the shy intellectual who wanted to fade into the background, William Randolph Hearst was a supernova. He was loud. He was brash. He was the only son of a remarkably wealthy miner, George Hearst. But he didn't care about mining. He didn't want to pull gold from the ground. He wanted to pull influence from the air. Hearst was a newspaper man, but he wasn't a journalist in the sense of seeking objective truth. He was a shaper of reality. He invented yellow journalism. He understood long before the internet or 24-hour news cycles that fear, sex, and a scandal sold. He built a media empire that controlled the eyeballs of millions of Americans. At his peak, 1 in 4 Americans read a Hearst newspaper. He owned magazines, radio stations, movie studios. He was the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, and the Rupert Murdoch of his day, all rolled into one towering, terrifying figure. And he was a man of contradictions, who was a populist who claimed to speak for the working man, yet he lived like a Bourbon king. He was a man who railed against the elites, yet he built a castle that physically looked down upon the world. He was married, yet he lived openly at the castle with his mistress, the actress Marion Davies, in a scandalous arrangement that polite society whispered about, but dared not challenge, because he bought the ink by the barrel. He wanted to be president. He ran and failed. He wanted to be governor. He ran and failed. So rejected by the voters, he retreated to his hill and built a place where he could never be voted out, a place where his word was absolute law. In the dining room, the refectory, the table was laid with the finest silver and china, but down the center of the table were bottles of ketchup and jars of mustard, paper napkins. Why? Because he wanted to remind his guests and himself that this was just the ranch. It was a power play. I am so rich I can build a cathedral and use it as a campsite. But the construction of this dream required more than just money and ego. It required a partner, a translator who could take Hearst's chaotic, ever-changing bursts of inspiration and turn them into steel and stone. Enter Julia Morgan. If Hearst was the storm, Morgan was the anchor. In 1919, a female architect was a rarity. A female architect running a project of this magnitude was unheard of. She was the first woman admitted to the Beaux-Arts architecture program in Paris. She was tiny, soft-spoken, and utterly brilliant. And for 28 years, she engaged in a daily dance with Hearst. He would send her telegrams, endless telegrams. Miss Morgan, I saw a tower in Seville. Can we add 2 of them? Miss Morgan, the pool is too small. Miss Morgan, move the staircase. And she did it. She engineered the impossible. When he wanted to move a massive oak tree because it was in the way of a terrace, she didn't cut it down. She built a concrete box around the roots and moved the tree. A tree weighing hundreds of tons, just moved it a few feet to the left because the client wanted it. They worked on the castle through the roaring 20s. They worked on it through the crash of 1929. They worked on it through the Great Depression. While the rest of America stood in bread lines, the hammers at San Simeon never stopped ringing. The art dealers in New York and London rubbed their hands together every time Hearst walked in. He was buying up the heritage of Europe and stacking it on a hill in California. But as we stand here in 1919, at the very beginning of this saga, looking at the first foundations being dug into the limestone, we have to ask the question that haunts every room of this castle. Was it ever finished? The answer is no. It was never finished. It was a living organism, a manifestation of a hunger that could never be sated. Hearst kept building, kept expanding, kept tweaking until the very end. So picture the scene again. The sun is setting over the Pacific. The fog is rolling in, wrapping the hill in a blanket of white, cutting it off from the world below. The lights of the Casa Grande flicker on, blazing like a lighthouse in the void. Inside, the fire is roaring in a fireplace that once warmed a French duke. A jazz record is spinning, and William Randolph Hearst sits at the head of the table, surrounded by the beautiful and the damned, the famous and the sycophants, raising a glass to his creation. He has built a monument to himself, a fortress against mediocrity. But as we will see, even walls of stone and rivers of money cannot keep the real world at bay forever. The enchanted hill was a paradise, yes, but every paradise has a snake, and every empire, no matter how high it sits, eventually begins to crack. This is the story of how the king of media built his Xanadu, and it starts with a single shovel in the dirt. But to understand how it ends, we have to go deeper. We have to walk the halls. We have to open the closets. We have to look past the gold leaf and the marble and see the machinery of the man who tried to buy immortality. Welcome to La Cuesta Encantada. Picture this: San Francisco, April 1919. A meeting takes place that will alter the skyline of the California coast forever. On one side of the desk sits William Randolph Hearst, a man who occupies a space like a mountain range, loud, expansive, a man used to commanding armies of reporters, a man who treats the truth as a suggestion and reality as a first draft. On the other side, a woman, tiny, fragile looking. She stands barely 5 feet tall. She weighs perhaps 100 pounds soaking wet. She speaks in a voice so soft you have to lean in to hear it. She wears tailored suits and wire-rimmed glasses that hide eyes of startling intelligence. To the casual observer, she looks like a librarian or a school teacher, but make no mistake, Julia Morgan was made of steel. If Hearst was the immovable object, Morgan was the irresistible force. And to understand the castle, you have to understand the architect. Because in 1919, women did not build empires. They didn't design skyscrapers. They certainly didn't manage multi-million-dollar construction projects in the middle of a wilderness that would make a goat hesitate. But Julia Morgan wasn't just a woman. She was a singularity. The first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Let that sink in. The most prestigious architecture school on the planet. They didn't want her. They failed her entrance exams arbitrarily. They hazed her. They isolated her. And she simply outworked them. She outdrew them. She outcalculated them. She became the first licensed female architect in California. When Hearst looked at her, he didn't see a woman. He saw a structural engineer. He saw a genius. He saw the only human being on earth capable of taking the chaos inside his head and pouring it into concrete. They called it the chief and the architect, a partnership that would last 28 years. 28 years of construction, 28 years of blueprints, and what they were attempting makes Biltmore look like a weekend DIY project. Remember the logistics of Biltmore? A train line, a town nearby? Difficult, yes. But San Simeon? San Simeon was the edge of the world. It was 250 miles from Los Angeles, 250 miles from San Francisco. It was nowhere. There was no train. There was no highway. There was only a dirt cow path that turned into a muddy river when it rained. There was no water source capable of supporting a palace. There was no electricity. There was nothing but a scrub oak, cattle, and gravity. To build the dream, they first had to build a port. They constructed a massive wooden wharf into the Pacific Ocean just to land the materials. Steamships would dock, groaning under the weight of the dream. And then the real struggle began. The hill, La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill, rises 1,600 feet above the ocean, a steep, winding, treacherous ascent. Every bag of cement, every steel beam, every crate of priceless art had to be hauled up that slope. Picture the scene. It's 1922. A convoy of heavy-duty trucks, their engines a-screaming, gears grinding, crawling up 5 miles of dirt switchbacks. In the summer, the dust was so thick it choked the engines. In the winter, the mud was so deep the trucks would sink to their axles. Hearst didn't care. Get it up the hill, he commanded. And Julia Morgan made it happen. She designed the road. She designed the water system, piping spring water from miles away across mountainous terrain, a feat of hydraulic engineering that rivals municipal waterworks. But the construction of the shell was only the beginning, because Hearst wasn't just building a house, he was assembling a museum. And this is where the story shifts from engineering to plunder. Buying art is a hobby for the wealthy. You buy a painting, you hang it on a wall, you buy a statue, you put it in the corner. Hearst? Hearst didn't want to hang art. He wanted to live inside it. He didn't just buy the painting. He bought the wall the painting hung on. He didn't just buy the altar. He bought the church. We are talking about an appetite for acquisition that borders on pathology, a hunger so vast it devoured centuries of European history. Hearst would travel to Europe or send his agents with a checkbook that had no bottom. He walked through the great houses of England, the monasteries of Spain, the chateaux of France, and he didn't just admire the craftsmanship, he bought it. I like that ceiling, he would say, and his agents would buy the ceiling, not a copy, the actual ceiling. Picture a 15th century Spanish monastery. The ceiling is a masterpiece of intricate wood carving, gilded with gold, darkened by the smoke of incense from 500 years of prayers. Hearst buys it. Workers erect scaffolding. They dismantle the ceiling piece by piece. They number every board. They crate it. They ship it across the Atlantic Ocean to a warehouse in the Bronx. Then they ship it through the Panama Canal, then up the coast to San Simeon, then up the dirt road, and then Julia Morgan has to figure out how to install a 15th century Spanish ceiling into a 20th century California dining room. This happened not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. The refectory, the main dining hall, is the size of a cathedral. The ceiling, carved life-size saints from an Italian palazzo, the choir stalls lining the walls, Sienese dating back to the Middle Ages, the silk flags hanging above, paleo banners from Siena, the fireplace, French Gothic, large enough to roast a whole ox, dragged stone by stone from a castle in Burgundy. He bought Roman mosaics dating back to the 1st century. He had them dug up, crated, and relaid in the floors of his hallway. When you walk through Hearst Castle, you're not walking on replicas. You're walking on the Roman Empire. You're touching the Renaissance. You're sleeping under the Gothic period. It was a jigsaw puzzle of history, comprising thousands of pieces, spanning thousands of miles and thousands of years, all being assembled by one woman on a hilltop in California. But the logistics of installation were a nightmare. The dimensions of these antique rooms rarely matched the dimensions of the steel frame Morgan was building. A fireplace might be 12 feet wide. The wall was 10. Did they cut the fireplace? No. They moved the wall. Morgan would have to redesign the entire structural steel cage of a wing just to accommodate a new acquisition. And the acquisitions never stopped. At the foot of the hill, in the tiny village of San Simeon, warehouses began to spring up. Great cavernous barns. They were built to hold the overflow, because Hearst was buying faster than Morgan could build, and he was buying faster than he could even catalog. The warehouses of wealth. That's what they were. Imagine walking into one. The air is thick with the smell of sawdust and dry rot. Towers of crates, stacked 30 feet high, stretching back into the gloom. Inside, who knows? A vase from the Ming Dynasty, a sarcophagus from Egypt, a suit of armor from Germany. There were stories of crates that sat unopened for 20 years. Hearst would flip through an art catalog, circle 5 items, and wire the money. They would arrive, be trucked to the warehouse, and vanish into the pile. He owned things he had never seen. He owned treasures he had forgotten he bought. It was hoarding, pure and simple, but it was hoarding on a scale that could bankrupt nations. At one point, it was estimated that Hearst accounted for 25% of the world's entire art market. One man, buying one out of every 4 antiques sold on the planet. And up on the hill, the jackhammers never stopped. This is the sound of San Simeon, not the wind in the oaks, not the crash of the surf. The sound of San Simeon was the pneumatic drill. For 28 years, from 1919 to 1947, the construction crew was a permanent population. They lived there. They raised families there. There were craftsmen who had spent their entire adult lives working on the castle, growing old with a trowel in their hand. Why? Because Hearst was never satisfied. He was the tinkerer. He treated concrete like clay. He would walk through a nearly completed room, a room that had taken 6 months of labor to finish. He would look at the fireplace. He would tilt his head. "Miss Morgan," he would say, "I think the fireplace would look better over there. Over there might be 5 feet to the left, To move a fireplace 5 feet in a structure made of reinforced concrete is not like moving a sofa. It means jackhammers. It means tearing down the wall. It means cutting through the steel rebar. It means dust. It means noise. It means destruction. Julia Morgan wouldn't blink. She wouldn't argue. She would nod, adjust her glasses, and say, "All right, Mr. Hearst." And the next morning, the wall would come down. The Neptune pool. You've seen pictures of it. The most beautiful swimming pool on earth. White marble, Roman columns reflecting in the turquoise water. A temple facade imported from Rome standing at one end. It looks eternal, doesn't it? Like it has been there since the time of Caesar. They built it 3 times. 3 times. The first pool was lovely. A standard garden pool. Hearst swam in it. He decided it was too small. "Tear it out," he said. So they jackhammered it apart. They dug deeper. They built a second pool, grander, larger. They added statues. It was magnificent. It stood for years. Then Hearst acquired the facade of an ancient Roman temple, authentic columns, pediments, the works. He wanted it at the end of the pool, but the pool was too short to create the proper reflection. The proportions were wrong. "Tear it out," he said. Can you imagine the frustration, the waste, the sheer unadulterated hubris to take a marble masterpiece and smash it to rubble because the reflection isn't quite right? They expanded the basin again. They poured thousands of tons of concrete. They lined it with Vermont marble. They installed the temple. Finally, on the 3rd try, it was perfect. This was the rhythm of the hill. Build, destroy, rebuild, expand. Morgan designed the main house, Casa Grande, to look like a Spanish cathedral. It has twin bell towers rising into the sky. It is covered in intricate limestone carvings. But underneath that limestone skin, it is a fortress of modern engineering. Reinforced concrete, steel trusses. Morgan knew California. She knew the ground moved. She designed the castle to ride out an earthquake, like a ship rides out a storm. She hid the technology, the heating systems, the electrical wiring, the structural supports, all invisible, hidden behind the tapestries and the wood paneling. It was a magic trick. To the eye, it was the 16th century. To the engineer, it was the cutting edge of the 1920s. She built a movie theater for him, not a room with a projector, a palace of cinema, damask walls, caryatids holding up the lights, and the screen rose from the floor at the touch of a button. It was technology married to fantasy. But as the main house grew, so did the guest houses. 3 of them. Cottages, he called them. Casa del Sol, Casa del Monte, Casa del Mar. Calling them cottages is a lie. Casa del Mar alone is larger than most mansions. It has a view of the Pacific that stretches to the horizon. It has gold leaf on the ceilings. It has bathrooms where the fixtures are gold-plated, and the tubs are carved from single blocks of marble. And connecting it all, the gardens. Hearst didn't just want a house, he wanted Eden. He wanted color, he wanted life. He imported topsoil, millions of tons of it, because the hill was rock. They blasted craters into the rock and filled them with soil just to plant trees. He didn't plant saplings. He didn't have the patience to watch a tree grow. He wanted a forest, and he wanted it now. He paid to have fully grown oak trees, hundreds of years old, dug up from the surrounding valleys. They boxed the roots in crates the size of houses. They built special trucks to haul them up the hill. They planted a mature forest in a matter of months. If a tree died, he replaced it. If a flower bed wasn't blooming the right shade of purple, he ripped it out. The esplanade, a walkway paved with English slate, lined with flowers that were rotated constantly so that nothing was ever out of season. It was a botanical impossibility, a perpetual spring manufactured by money and labor, and in the center of this manufactured paradise, the animals. We haven't even touched on the zoo. Yes, a zoo, the largest private zoo in the world. Hearst wanted his guests to feel like they were in a different reality. So as you drove up that winding road, you didn't just see cows, you saw zebras, you saw ostriches running through the California grass, you saw kangaroos hopping over the fences. He built specialized enclosures for carnivores, lions, tigers, bears, leopards. He had a polar bear. In California, they required blocks of ice to be trucked up the hill daily to keep the water cold. The sheer logistical madness of keeping a polar bear comfortable in the Central Coast heat is a testament to the man's refusal to accept the word no. He treated the world's fauna the same way he treated its architecture. He collected it, he caged it, he displayed it. By the mid-1930s, the castle was a functioning city. It had its own power plant, its own water supply, its own police force, its own fire department. It had a staff of hundreds: gardeners, maids, cooks, cowboys, zookeepers, projectionists, telephone operators. And presiding over it all was Julia Morgan, the quiet architect. She worked 18-hour days. She ate sandwiches at her drafting table. She walked the scaffolding in the wind. She managed the temper tantrums of the richest man in the world. She managed the egos of the art dealers. She managed the labor disputes of the workers. She never married. She never had children. The castle was her child, a child that refused to grow up, a child that demanded more and more and more. There is a tragedy in the construction. It was never finished. Look closely at the back of the main house today. It's raw concrete, rebar sticking out like rusted ribs. They ran out of time. They ran out of money. Yes, even Hearst ran out of money eventually. But mostly, they ran out of life. But in the golden years, in the 1920s and 30s, it was the stage for the greatest show on earth. The construction was just the backdrop. The jackhammers were just the rhythm section. The stage was set. The lights were focused. The script was written. And the actors were about to arrive. Because you don't build a castle just to sit in it alone. You build it to be seen. You build it to be envied. You build it to hold the court of the king. The architecture was complete. The plunder was displayed. The trap was set. Now, it was time to fill the rooms. It was time for the parties. It was time for the stars. It was time for the scandal. The stones of Europe were about to witness the sins of Hollywood. The monastery ceilings were about to look down on the wildest parties the West Coast had ever seen. The house was built, but the legend was just beginning to breathe. Scene a start. Vo, picture this. It is Saturday night, 1933. The Great Depression is clawing at the throat of America. Bread lines stretch for blocks in New York. Dust storms are burying Oklahoma. But here on La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill, the champagne is flowing like the fountains outside. We have moved beyond the architecture now. We are inside the machine. Because Hearst Castle wasn't just a building. It was a stage set for the greatest show on earth, starring the people who manufactured dreams for a living, the weekend ritual. It became the holy grail of Hollywood social climbing. If you were invited to San Simeon, you had made it. If you weren't, you were nobody. The invitation would come by phone, usually on a Wednesday. Mr. Hearst would be delighted if you would join him this weekend. You didn't say no. You didn't ask who else would be there. You packed your bags. The guests would board a private train car in Los Angeles on Friday night. The elite of the elite, Clark Gable, Charlie Chaplin, Greta Garbo, Cary Grant. They would drink and gossip as the train chugged north through the darkness, finally arriving at the coastal station in the early morning mist. Then, a fleet of limousines would carry them up that winding 5-mile road, ascending from the marine layer into the blinding California sun. And what they found at the top was a world suspended in disbelief. Imagine walking into the assembly room. This was the main gathering space. It is a room so large it swallows you whole. The ceiling isn't just a ceiling. It is a carved wooden masterpiece from an Italian palazzo, purchased, dismantled, shipped, and reassembled here. The tapestries on the walls are not reproductions. They are 16th century Flemish works depicting the triumphs of Scipio Africanus. Priceless, irreplaceable. And amidst this museum-grade splendor, what were the guests doing? They were playing charades. They were doing jigsaw puzzles. This is the central paradox of Hearst Castle. It was a palace that pretended to be a ranch. Hearst insisted on calling it the ranch. Guests were instructed to dress informally, but informal at San Simeon had a different definition. It meant diamonds at dinner were optional, but you'd better look like a movie star. Dinner was the main event. It took place in the refectory. Picture a room that looks like a medieval cathedral. High, clear-story windows, silk banners from Siena, Italy, hanging from the walls representing the various wards of the city, a massive fireplace that could roast a whole ox, and running down the center, a long monastic table. But look closer at the table settings. You see antique silverware, heavy and gleaming. You see crystal goblets, and right next to them, paper napkins, bottles of ketchup, jars of mustard, pickles. Hearst loved this juxtaposition. He was the king of American media, a man worth hundreds of millions, sitting at the head of a table surrounded by medieval saints, pouring Heinz ketchup onto a steak. It was a power move. It said, I am so rich, I don't need to follow the rules of the rich. I make the rules. And the rules were strict. One cocktail before dinner. That was it. Hearst hated drunks. If you smuggled a flask into your room, and many did, including some of the most famous actors of the day, you had to be discreet. If you were caught swaying or slurring, a servant would quietly pack your bags, and a car would be waiting to take you to the station. You were banished, exiled from paradise. Marion Davies was the heart of it all. Hearst's mistress, the hostess. While Hearst was the brooding emperor, Marion was the laughter. She was the one who snuck the gin. She was the one who got Chaplin to do his little tramps routine on the floor. She made the castle livable. Without her, it would have been a mausoleum. With her, it was a party. But the party didn't stop at the walls of the Casa Grande. It spilled out onto the grounds, and this brings us to one of the most surreal aspects of the estate. The zoo, not a metaphor, a literal zoo. Hearst didn't just want art, he wanted nature. He wanted to own the animal kingdom just as he owned the newspapers. He built the largest private zoo in the world. Imagine waking up in one of the opulent guest cottages. You walk out onto your terrace, coffee in hand, looking out over the Santa Lucia Mountains. And there, grazing on the hillside, is a herd of zebras. You rub your eyes, but they are still there. Hearst imported them by the crate-load. Zebras, camels, sambars, red deer, Barbary sheep, kangaroos. He had a giraffe enclosure. He had an elephant. He had lions and tigers and bears, oh yes, kept in pits that were designed to look natural but were secure enough to keep the predators from eating the movie stars. Picture the absurdity. Winston Churchill visiting the estate, wandering the gardens, and coming face to face with a polar bear. The polar bears had their own enclosure, fed with blocks of ice trucked in daily to keep them cool in the California heat. It was madness. It was divine madness. Hearst wrote to his zookeeper with the same micromanaging intensity he used for his editors. The animals must have the best view, he said. He worried about the yak's coat. He fretted over the ostrich's diet. He wanted a living collection to match his inanimate one. But beneath the laughter of Marion Davies, beneath the roar of the lions, beneath the clinking of crystal and the rustle of paper napkins, there was a darker current, a jagged edge that most guests chose to ignore. The money was running out. You cannot build a personal Versailles, fill it with the plunder of Europe, staff it with an army, and run a private zoo during the Great Depression without feeling the pinch. Even if you are William Randolph Hearst, the spending was pathological. It wasn't just the castle, it was the other estates. Wintoun, St. Donat's in Wales, the beach house in Santa Monica, and the buying, the incessant, compulsive buying. Dealers in Europe knew him as the ultimate mark. If a dealer had a mediocre tapestry, he'd mark up the price, call it a masterpiece, and Hearst would buy it. He bought entire monasteries in boxes that he never even opened. Warehouses in the Bronx were bursting with crates of antiques that hadn't seen the light of day in years. By the late 1930s, the empire was teetering. The Hearst Corporation was $126 million in debt. That is a staggering sum for the era. Creditors were circling, the banks were nervous. Hearst, the man who controlled public opinion, suddenly lost control of his own checkbook. He was forced to cede financial control to a trustee, a judge, a bean counter. Can you imagine the humiliation? The emperor told he could no longer buy. The man who reshaped the skyline told he had to sell. The construction at San Simeon slowed. It didn't stop. Hearst would never let it stop completely. But the fever cooled. The grand plans for the Great Wing were shelved. The mosaic tiles lay in stacks, waiting for hands that would never place them. There is a tragedy in the unfinished. Walk around the castle today, if you know where to look, you can see it. You can see the raw concrete where marble should be. You can see the gaps in the dream, the Neptune pool, that glorious, impossible expanse of Roman excess, was rebuilt 3 times. 3 times. Because Hearst didn't like the curve of the wall or the placement of a statue. He would tear it out and start again. But in the end, time ran out. In 1947, Hearst's health began to fail. His heart, that engine of ambition, was tiring. The doctors told him he had to leave the hill. He needed to be closer to medical care in the city. This is the most haunting moment in the story. Picture the old man, 84 years old, frail, shrunken. He walks out of the Casa Grande for the last time. He gets into the car. Marion is with him. As the car starts down the winding road, descending from the clouds, does he look back? Does he look at the towers rising like a mirage against the blue sky? Does he think about the millions of dollars, the thousands of stones, the decades of noise and dust? He reportedly teared up. He knew he would never see it again. He was leaving his life's work unfinished. He died 4 years later in Beverly Hills, far from the silence of his mountain. And the castle? It sat there, a silent leviathan. The zebras still grazed on the hills, wild and confused. The polar bears were sent to zoos. The laughter of the Hollywood set faded into echoes. The Hearst Corporation didn't know what to do with it. It was a white elephant of epic proportions, too expensive to maintain, too magnificent to destroy. In 1957, they did the only thing they could do. They gave it to the state of California. And so, the private dream became a public monument. Today, you can take a bus up that same winding road. You can stand where Gable stood. You can look into the refectory and see the ketchup bottles. But there is a ghostly quality to it now. It feels like a set where the actors have just walked off for a break, but they've been gone for 70 years. Hearst Castle stands as a monument to American excess, yes, but it is more than that. It is a museum of a specific kind of madness, the madness of trying to buy history, the madness of trying to build a wall against mortality. Hearst tried to import the past, the ceilings of Spain, the statues of Egypt, the tapestries of Flanders, to give himself a sense of permanence. He wanted to graft himself onto the timeline of kings and emperors. He wanted to be a Medici in a Stetson hat, and in a way he succeeded, but not how he intended. The irony is that the most beautiful things at San Simeon are not the things he bought. It's the light. The golden California light hitting the white stone towers at sunset, the smell of the bay laurel and the ocean breeze, the view of the Pacific stretching out to infinity. These were the things that were there before he laid a single brick. And they are the things that remain. The unfinished nature of the castle is its final, perfect poetic truth, because a dream like this can never be finished. It is a hunger that can never be sated. As you walk back to the bus, leaving the enchanted hill, you pass the empty cages of the zoo. You pass the Neptune pool, still shimmering, breathless in its beauty. And you realize that Biltmore was a home. It was a statement of dynasty. But Hearst Castle was a movie written, directed, and produced by one man playing on a loop forever. And just like in the movies, when the lights come up, you have to go home. You have to leave the dream behind. But as the bus winds down and the towers disappear behind the ridge, you can't help but feel it. The pull, the desire, the sheer audacious envy. Because for a brief, shining moment, atop this lonely hill, a man didn't just live, he ruled.